Hi there, it's Samantha, and welcome back to Wife Stewardship Podcast. I'm so thankful that you have joined me for another week as we continue our verse-by-verse journey through the book of Esther. So today we arrive at one of the most powerful chapters in the entire book. Esther chapter 5 teaches us about faith, courage, wisdom, patience, and trust in God's timing. We begin to see God's unseen hand moving even though his name is never mentioned throughout the book. This chapter reminds us that God is always working behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, preparing hearts, and positioning his people exactly where they need to be. Before we begin, let's take a moment to recap the previous chapters. Now, in chapter 1, we were introduced to King Ahasuerus and Queen Vashti. Vashti refused the king's command, resulting in her removal as queen. Although this seemed like a political event, God was already preparing the way for Esther long before anyone knew his plan. Then in chapter 2, we meet Esther, a young Jewish woman who had been raised by her cousin Mordecai after the death of her parents. God gave Esther favor with everyone around her, including Haggai, the keeper of the women, and eventually King Ahasuerus. Esther was crowned queen, replacing Vashti. While Mordecai uncovered a conspiracy to assassinate the king, his act of loyalty was recorded in the king's chronicles, although at the time he received no reward. Then in chapter 3, Haman was promoted above all the princes of Persia. Everyone was commanded to bow before him except Mordecai. Mordecai refused because his loyalty belonged to God above any man. Haman's wounded pride turned into hatred, and instead of seeking revenge only against Mordecai, he plotted to destroy every Jew throughout the Persian Empire. Then in chapter 4, everything changed. The decree spread throughout the provinces, bringing mourning, fasting, weeping, and prayer among God's people. Mordecai challenged Esther with one of the most well-known verses in Scripture. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, the 4th chapter, the 14th verse. Rather than remaining silent, Esther called all the Jews to fast for 3 days and 3 nights. She declared one of the greatest statements of faith in Scripture. If I perish, I perish. Esther understood that obedience sometimes requires courage. She chose to trust God regardless of the outcome. Now we come to chapter 5, where Esther takes the first courage step toward fulfilling God's purpose. Esther risks the king's disfavor. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 1st verse. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. Notice the very first words, on the 3rd day. This was the 3rd day after the nationwide fast that Esther had called. For 3 days, she had sought God alongside Mordecai, her maidens, and the Jewish people. She did not rush into the king's presence relying on her position as queen. She first sought her father. This teaches us an important principle. Before Esther ever approached an earthly king, she sought the King of Kings. The fasting had ended. The prayer had ended. Now came the moment to walk in faith. Esther dressed herself in royal garments. This was more than simply putting on beautiful clothing. She was stepping into the position God had given her. The same woman who had once been an orphan was now standing in the palace as a queen, not because of chance, but because of God's providence. Yet, despite wearing the royal apparel, Esther still faced tremendous danger. Persian law stated that anyone who entered the king's inner court without being summoned could be put to death unless the king extended his golden scepter. Every step Esther took toward the throne could have been her last. Faith is not absence of fear. It is choosing obedience despite fear. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 2nd verse. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Here we see the answer to the 3 days of fasting and prayer. The king saw Esther. She obtained favor. The golden scepter was extended. What had seemed like certain death became an open door. Although the text does not explicitly say, we can see the fingerprints of God's providence. The favor Esther received was not merely the result of her appearance or position. Throughout the book, God repeatedly replaces favor upon Esther at the right moment. The golden scepter represented mercy. Without it, Esther would have died. With it, she was welcomed. This reminds us that God often opens doors that no man, no human being can open. When he grants favor, obstacles that once seemed impossible suddenly become opportunities. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 3rd verse. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. The king immediately recognized that Esther had not risked her life merely to greet him. She had come with a purpose. His generous offer, up to half of the kingdom, was a customary expression of royal generosity. Rather than a literal promise to divide the empire, it demonstrated the king's willingness to hear her request. God had already softened the king's heart before Esther even spoke. Sometimes God prepares the hearts of others before we even arrive. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 4th through the 8th verses. Instead of immediately revealing Haman's plot, Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet. Then when the king again asked her request, she invited them to a second banquet the following day. Many people may wonder, why didn't Esther tell the king immediately? The text does not tell us her exact reasoning, so we should be careful not to claim more than the scripture does. What we do see is that Esther acted with patience and wisdom rather than haste. She did not allow fear to rush her. She did not allow emotion to control her. She waited for the right moment. Sometimes wisdom is not only knowing what to say, but also when to say it. There are seasons when God calls us to speak immediately, and there are seasons when he teaches us to wait on his timing. Faith trusts God's timing as much as it trusts God's power. Now, we've gotten to Haman's pride being exposed. This is Esther, the 5th chapter, the 9th verse. Haman left the banquet joyful and honored because he believed he occupied the highest position in the kingdom. Yet, the moment he saw Mordecai refusing to bow, all his joy disappeared. One man's refusal destroyed all of Haman's happiness. This reveals something about pride. A proud heart can possess great wealth, power, influence, and honor, yet still remain dissatisfied because it constantly seeks validation from others. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 10th through the 12th verses. Haman gathered his friends and his wife, Zeresh, and began listing all of his accomplishments. His wealth, his many children, his promotions, his position above the princes, his exclusive invitation to Esther's banquet. He measured success by the status and recognition. Yet, despite all he possessed, he remained empty. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 13th verse. This may be one of the saddest statements in Haman's life. Yet all that availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate. One man stole his peace. One offense consumed his thoughts. One wounded pride overshadowed every blessing. This is what bitterness does. It blinds us to everything God has already placed in our lives. Haman had nearly everything the world could offer, yet he could not enjoy any of it because resentment had taken root in his heart. Esther, the 5th chapter, the 14th verse. Instead of encouraging humility, Zeresh and Haman's friends fueled his anger. They advised him to build a gallows 50 cubits high and asked the king for permission to hang Mordecai. Haman agreed immediately. Ironically, the instrument he intended for Mordecai would later become the instrument of his own judgment. This is another reminder that God sees beyond what people see. Haman's plans do not override God's purpose. Now, chapter 5 teaches us several enduring truths. Seek God before making difficult decisions. Courage often begins after seasons of prayer. God's timing is as important as God promises. Pride destroys contentment, and bitterness blinds us to God's blessings. God is always working behind the scenes, even when his name is not mentioned. Esther's courage and Haman's pride stand in sharp contrast. Esther sought God and waited patiently. Haman exalted himself and allowed pride to dictate his actions. One life demonstrates trust in God, the other demonstrates trust in self. The outcomes will soon reveal the difference. Now, in our next lesson, we will see how God begins to reverse the situation in remarkable ways. What appears to be Haman's greatest triumph becomes the beginning of his downfall, proving once again that God's providence is always at work, even when it seems hidden. Thank you for joining me today in this episode. I pray that this study encourages you to trust God's timing, walk in his obedience, and remember that the Lord is always working behind the scenes for his purposes and his glory.